Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Good evening. It's good to be together tonight to study the book of Revelation. Last week we talked about Satan, and I can't tell you how excited I am about tonight, right? Tonight we're going to talk about Satan's two, I hate to say minions, I guess I could say minions, beasts, the dragon's beasts. And tonight, I'm super excited about tonight. All week long I've been thinking about it because tonight, this particular chapter has shaped and formed my worldview and my understanding of what it means to be a disciple, what it means to be a pastor, what it means to be a part of the kingdom of God, and also what it means to be a citizen in this amazing country of America. And so I hope that tonight's chapter encourages you, challenges you, empowers you, frustrates you, and hopefully when you walk out of here tonight, you have some ahas. So let's go ahead and pray as we get started. Jesus, you are Lord, and no one else is. Grant us faithfulness and patient endurance while evil lashes about. Give us wisdom to recognize every monster unleashed by the dragon and to resist their seduction and violence. Give us ears to hear your Spirit calling us into the true and lasting life that no mind can imagine and no enemy can counterfeit. We pray this in the name of the Lamb. Amen. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Get your packet. We're on page 70, and we're going to do some review. This is a nice picture of Caesar Nero on the cover there for you. We're going to talk about him tonight. So let's review. The book of Revelation is a revelation of Jesus to John for the church against Babylon Empire during the first century. So there's a guy named John. He was a prophet, and he was a pastor, and he was on the Isle of Patmos, which is southwest of Ephesus. He was in exile or banished because of his faith in Jesus. While he was there on the Lord's Day, he was worshiping, and he received a vision, a revelation of Jesus. And he was called to dictate a letter to 7 churches. This vision in which he sees Jesus in the center of 7 lampstands. 7 is the number of perfection and completeness. Lampstands are tied to the Old Testament, tied into the temple, as well as Zechariah, and it is a message of the people of God or the church. And so we find out that these 7 lampstands that Jesus is in the middle of represent the 7 churches in which this letter is being sent to. And the letter to the 7 churches, or the letters to the 7 churches, talk about what does it mean to be faithful to Jesus in a culture that's faithless. And the 7 churches reacted all differently to that challenge. Some of them responded faithfully, and they were persecuted because of it. Some forgot their first love, like Ephesus, and put up boundaries to keep people who were different than them out of the church. Some churches looked alive, like this past Sunday we talked about Sardis, but in fact was dead. So there's all variations in how they responded. And so at the end of the 7 letters, we realized that the temptations that those churches were experiencing, the temptations to compromise, are very similar to the temptations that we experience in the church today. In chapter 4, John is taken up into heaven. The curtain is pulled back, and he gets to see what's really going on. Down on earth, it looked like Caesar and the Roman Empire was in charge. Caesar was on the throne. But when he goes up to heaven and sees what's real, what is really true, he sees that God is on the throne. God is in control. And there's this whole scene about who is worthy to read the scroll that has God's will God's kingdom coming on earth as it is in heaven, God's plan for the future, God's way towards flourishing. And no one is worthy, so John collapses in distress, and an elder says, look, there is the Lion of Judah, and John looks, and he sees a lamb that is slaughtered to death, a little lamb. But the lamb is standing. And so the lamb is Jesus, and Jesus goes and sits with his Father on the throne and begins to unseal the scroll. And bad stuff starts happening on earth. The 7 seals correspond to the 4 horsemen, and then there is this scene of the martyrs underneath the altar, and then there's this earthquake, the day of the Lord, that takes place. And then there's this interlude in which the people of God are given seals. 144,000 are given seals on their forehead. They are sealed with the Spirit of God. They are marked as God's people. They are an army. And then we get to the trumpets, and the trumpets, again, bad stuff happens. God takes his hand off the steering wheel, and people see what happens. These plagues take place, reminiscent of Exodus in Egypt, and the gods of this world are defeated by the one true God. There is this interlude that takes place between the 6th and the 7th trumpet, in which John is asked to eat the scroll, the same scroll that Jesus was popping the seals off of, and he embodies the message. God's kingdom coming on earth as in heaven is part of John now. John is now called to be a prophet, to speak the message of God's truth to the world. And then what happens right after that, there's 2 witnesses, which corresponds to the church. Number 2 is the people of God or the church. There's these 2 witnesses who are witnessing, and then they died, and then were resurrected and ascended. They followed the footsteps of Jesus. And that's a call to the church to walk in the footsteps of the slaughtered lamb, to be willing to witness, to become a martyr if necessary for the kingdom, but understanding that the resurrection is at the end of that path, and the ascension to be with Jesus in heaven. And then we discover that the people end up repenting and glorifying God, and then there's this ending. There's this ending of a section. God's kingdom has come. The God who was and is being worshipped, and there's a hymn being sung. And then last week we began the next section, which is really just a kind of going back and telling the story from a different perspective. In this particular perspective, tells us why suffering takes place. It tells us why there is persecution, why there's attack in the church, why there's temptation for compromise within the 7 churches. And so what we end up seeing is the story of Satan. And there is a Jesus is born, dies, and resurrected, and goes to heaven, and there's a war in heaven, and Satan is defeated, and Satan is cast to earth. And Satan wages war against the people that are left, the children of God, the church. And today, we carry on from that, and we're going to discover how the dragon is going to make war against the church. We're going to discover how the dragon Satan is going to coerce the church to compromise. We're really going to understand what's going on when we read the 7 churches, because we're going to see that there's someone pulling the strings with the Roman Empire and with Caesar. And so we're kind of setting up the situation. Can you tell I'm really excited about tonight? All right, so a little background information on Nero. So Nero Redivivus, which is Latin for return, the return of Nero. Just want to talk about this legend real quick, a little bit about Nero. When you think of Caesar Nero, what do you think of? Anything come to mind? Anybody remember history of Nero? Anybody remember about him? Well, yeah. Yes. Yeah, Rome burned down, and he blamed, who did he blame for the burning of the, anybody remember? Christians. Yeah. can we just say Nero was crazy? Can we just say? He was, I mean, if somebody did a profile on him, he would have some challenges. He killed his mother. He killed his wife. And this fire broke out in a section of the city, and he blamed the Christians for it. We don't know who started it. Some rumors say he did. I don't know. But he blamed the Christians. And so he started the persecution of Christians. He was the first emperor that persecuted Christians. He would crucify them. He would feed them to lions. He would kill people and put them on a stake and cover them in tar and light them on fire as for his garden parties, so people could go through. I mean, this guy was crazy, right? Well, in 68 or 69, he was disposed, obviously, for being crazy. And shortly after that, he committed suicide with a knife. But then a legend began that Caesar Nero was going to come back. He was going to be resurrected. He was going to come back and he was going to lead Rome into the glory days, or he's going to lead them into a new era of prosperity. And so throughout the next 20 years, there was these Neros that showed up. Not Nero, he wasn't resurrected, but people who pretended that they were Nero, and they actually caused revolts and tried to take over the capital. So there was this big legend that Nero was going to come back. And so we have to understand that that was the fear. Nero would probably be, I mean, the closest thing that we would have to a comparison would be Hitler, just from an evil dude, right? And so there was always this fear that there was going to be another Nero who was going to come back, the return of Nero. And so the Romans feared that, but the world feared it. And so we kind of have to understand that's a little bit of the background here. Any questions about Nero before we jump into our text today? Crazy Nero. There's a lot of good documentaries on him. If you're ever on History Channel or something, see something on him, it's quite entertaining. And entertaining is the wrong word. Never mind. Disturbing, maybe, is that. All right, so let's go ahead and start our scriptures today. We're going to be Revelation chapter 13. In fact, we're going to just back up one verse. We're going to read that 18th verse in the last chapter. It's listed right there because it's kind of bridges. Remember, when they wrote these things, there weren't chapters and they weren't verses. You know, those chapters and verses came later. And so sometimes when you see a separation like this, you're like, what in the world were these people thinking when they... But anyway, here we go. So verse 18 says, Then the dragon stood on the seashore, verse 1. And I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads. Each of his horns was decorated with a royal crown, and on its heads were blasphemous names. The beast I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth were like a lion's mouth. The dragon gave it his power, throne, and great authority. One of the heads appeared to have been slain and killed, but its deadly wound was healed. So the whole earth was amazed and followed the beast. They worshipped the dragon because it had given the beast its authority. They worshipped the beast and said, Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it? Verse 5. The beast was given a mouth that spoke boastful and blasphemous things, and it was given authority to act for 42 months. It opened its mouth to speak blasphemies against God. It blasphemed God's name and his dwelling place, that is, those who dwell in heaven. It was also allowed to make war on the saints and to gain victory over them. It was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All who live on earth worshipped it, all whose names hadn't been written from the time the earth was made in the scroll of life of the Lamb who was slain. Whoever has ears must listen. If any are to be taken captive, then into captivity they will go. If any are to be killed by the sword, then by the sword they will be killed. This calls for endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints. All right, well, let's talk about this beast, this sea beast. All right. What do we know about the sea? Chaos. From the very beginning of the Bible, there is this theme of chaos. The sea, the water is chaos. So we have this beast coming out of the sea. Beast coming out of chaos. In the Old Testament, they often talked about the Leviathan, which would be the sea beast or the sea monster. That's kind of a little bit of what we have going on here. The beast is, well, let me just ask you, who do you think the beast is? Anybody want to take a shot at it? Who does the beast represent? Anybody want to take a shot? The dragon is Satan. So the dragon standing on the seashore, and out from the sea comes the beast. So the beast is the first pawn of the dragon. The dragon is definitely going to imitate Christ. I'm sorry, the beast imitates Christ. Well, I'll just give you, I'll go ahead and tell you, because it's in chapter 17, it actually tells you who it is. But this first beast, the sea beast, is Rome. Rome. The first beast that comes out of the water is Rome. Right? So the dragon's first beast is the Roman Empire. All right? It's the sea beast. So I saw this beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads. Now, a little bit later in chapter 17, it talks about the 7 heads or the 7 hills. If you know anything about Rome, how many hills did it have? 7 hills. Kind of like Cincinnati, now that I think about it. But anyway, that's beside the point. I think so. That's where I kind of grew up there. And so this beast had 10 horns. Horns are about power. 7 heads, which a lot of times, and you'll see this in chapter 17, the heads correspond to 7 kings. And you'll kind of see that a little bit later. I don't want to spoil what all these symbols mean. But this idea that this beast is powerful. And so this beast, it looks like the dragon. If you remember last chapter, the dragon also had 7 heads with crowns on it. So this beast is resembling the dragon. I think it's important for us to recognize. Almost like the beast is a soldier of the dragon. The dragon empowers the beast to deceive people and to compromise their faith. So it comes out of the sea. And it's interesting that if you look, actually, can we put Daniel on the screen, Natalie? Daniel chapter 7, because this is where this beast and its different forms comes from. Daniel 7, check out the description that Daniel talks about. He's talking about 4 separate beasts or 4 separate monsters. So John is taking these 4 separate monsters or beasts and combining them into one super monster in Revelation. So check out what Daniel's saying. In the first year of Babylon, King Belshazzar, Daniel had a dream, a vision in his head. As he lay on his bed, he wrote the dream down. Here is the beginning of the account. I am Daniel. In the vision I had during the night, I saw 4 winds of heaven churning the great sea. 4 giant beasts emerged from the sea, each different from the others. The first was like a lion with eagle's wings. I observed it until its wings were pulled off, and it was lifted up from the ground. It was then set on 2 feet like a human being, and it received a human mind. So the first one was a lion. Then I saw another beast, a second one like a bear. It was raised on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. That's weird. It was told, get up, devour much flesh. So the second one was a bear. I kept watching, and suddenly there was another beast, this one like a leopard. On its back it had 4 wings like bird wings. This beast had 4 heads. Authority was given to it. So leopard. After this, as I continued to watch the night vision, I saw a 4th beast, terrifying and hideous, with extraordinary power and with massive iron teeth. As it ate and crushed, its feet smashed whatever was left over. It was different from all the other beasts before it. It had 10 horns. All right, so what we see here in Daniel's vision, Daniel saw 4 different beasts coming out of the water. But John describes this one beast with the same animals. Did you notice that? It was the same animals. It was a lion, it was a bear, it was a leopard, and then the last one had the 10 horns, I think it said. All right, so Daniel's seen this vision. If you read further in Daniel's vision, he's talking about 4 different nations. 4 different nations, 4 different kingdoms that rose up. And then it has this vision of one like the Son of Man comes and defeats these 4 beasts. So that's Daniel chapter 7. It's this vision of these. And so what we understand in Daniel is it's the rising of 4 kingdoms. Now, scholars and historians throughout the years have attributed these 4 beasts to Babylon, the Medes, the Persians, and Alexander the Great. And almost every scholar pretty much says that that was kind of looking at the history of these kingdoms. And so what John does is John takes those 4 images of 4 kingdoms and combines it into a super monster. Now that makes sense when you think about the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire defeated all. I mean, it took over everything. It made Alexander the Great, and it made the Medes and Greek and all these guys, Persians, it made them look kind of weak compared to what the Roman Empire did under Caesar. And so it's important that we recognize this image of this first beast, the sea beast, actually comes from Daniel. And it combines these 4 ways. And so there's this, how does the dragon attack God's people? How does the dragon tempt Satan, tempt God's people to compromise their faith? He uses the beast. He uses the Roman Empire, which, remember, what is the 7 churches? What is their temptation? To give in to the way of Rome, to give in to the way that Rome works, the Pax Romana. And so Satan is using the Roman Empire to tempt the church. Does that make sense? So what ends up happening here is we take a look at this beast. The beast is giving these mouth to speak blasphemous things, right? Well, now, when you think about Caesar and the Roman Empire, what was Caesar known at? What was his titles? Caesar was known as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Caesar was known as the Son of God and demanded worship. So when you think of Caesar in the Roman Empire, he kind of stepped on the area of spirituality and religion. And so these titles that were given to God, Caesar co-opted, and so then he's speaking blasphemy of God. And then it also talks about, in verse 7, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to gain victory over them. It was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All who lived on the earth worshipped it. Everyone except who had their names written in the book of life, right? So everyone who wasn't a Christian worshipped this beast. Who are they worshiping? The Roman Empire. Understand? And it says in verse, So in verse 4 it says, they worshiped the dragon because it had given the beast its authority. They worshiped the beast and said, who is like the beast and who can fight against it? In other words, they were worshiping the beast, and as they worshiped the Roman Empire, they were worshiping the dragon. Does everyone see that? And so how was Satan going to attack God's people? Remember, he already lost the war. So he was just going to bring as many people down with him as he could, right? How is he going to tempt the church? How is he going to coerce the church to not be the light to the world? How is he going to get the candle to go out? He was going to tempt the church to compromise their faith. And he was going to use the Roman Empire to do that. And so one of the ways that Satan works in our world, if you take a look at history, is he uses nations to do his dirty work. Well, just look at history. Just look at history. Egypt, right? He used Pharaoh. Same kind of empire building. You even look throughout all of history, the Old Testament, you see time and time again how Satan uses nations to tempt the people. Look at Solomon and all his wives and all his money, right? Solomon was led astray, right? And so even the people of God, even Jerusalem was known as a Babylon for a while, right? And God allowed Babylon to defeat Jerusalem as a way to take his hands off the steering wheel. And so it's very important that we see that the first way that Satan attacks the church is through the Roman Empire. Are you with me? Now, there is this thing in here that I skipped over on purpose, right? Go back up to verse 3. He's talking about the the beast, and it says, one of the heads appeared to have been slain and killed, but its deadly wound was healed. So the whole earth was amazed and followed the beast. All right? So one of the heads on this beast, there were 7 heads. One of the heads had a mortal wound. It was killed, but this head was resurrected. The head is symbolic of the kings. So one of the Caesars was killed, but was resurrected. Now, what did we just say about Nero, right? The legend. And so John is even using the legend of Nero, right, to communicate the superiority of God over what the dragon's up to. Because, I mean, we know, because we just read the last section, we know who wins, right? This is a retelling. God wins. God's kingdom comes on earth as it is in heaven. We already know that. So now we're retelling the story, and so we're seeing why all of this was going on in the churches. Why all of this was necessary of the seals and the trumpets and all of that. It's because there was an enemy that was pulling the strings behind everything that we had going on. And so there's a lot going on in this. But let me just ask, does anybody have any questions about this section? I got a little quote here. The beast, thank you. The beast, it's cut off on the paper. The beast is a symbol of the perpetual deification. The deification means to deify or to make like a god of secular authority. Even more, he represents the powers of evil which lie behind the kingdoms of this world and which encourage in society at any moment in history compromise with the truth and opposition to the justice and mercy of God. It's a good quote. That's what the beast is up to. It's not just Rome. Another word that we see for Rome in Revelation is Babylon. And we know that Babylon is a symbol of all the countries in history that uses the power to oppress people. So how does Satan work? Satan uses the power of nations to oppress people and do his work to tempt them. And that's not saying every nation, but that's how Satan works. That's one way. Now, if we want to go on to the next one, we're going to see the second beast. And we're going to see another way that Satan works. This beast is called the land beast. A little hint that happened a couple chapters ago. Do you remember the angel that came down that had the scroll, and he put 1 foot on the sea and 1 foot on the land? It's just a little hint that God and his army is more powerful than the sea beast and the land beast. In other words, the angel's feet are on the places that these beasts come from. So the land beast. Then I saw another beast coming up from earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it was speaking like a dragon. It exercises all authority of the first beast in its presence. It also makes the earth and those who live in it worship the first beast, whose fatal wound was healed. It does great signs, so that even it makes fire come down from heaven to earth in the presence of the people. It deceives those who live on earth by the signs that it was allowed to do in the presence of the beast. It told those who live on earth to make an image for the beast who had been wounded by the sword and yet came back to life. It was allowed to give breath to this beast image so that the beast image would even speak and cause anyone who didn't worship the beast image to put to death. It forces everyone, the small and great, the rich and poor, the free and slaves, to have a mark put on their right hand or on their forehead. It will not allow anyone to make a purchase or sell anything unless the person has the mark with the beast's name or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let anyone who understands calculate the beast's number, for it's a human being's number. The number is 666. Cue some Iron Maiden right there. Okay. Anyway, the land beast. It's almost like the land beast greets the sea beast. The sea beast comes out of the water, and there is the land beast. So who do you think the land beast is? Take any wild guesses? This is a hard one. A little bit later in Revelation it tells us, so I mean, I'm just kind of giving it away a little bit early. Anybody know? It's a false prophet. False prophet. Not just a false prophet. False prophets, maybe. It represents the false prophets. And I'll explain that here in a second. All right. So it looks like the lamb. This beast looks like the lamb, but speaks like a dragon. Looks like a lamb. So it looks like Jesus, but it doesn't speak like Jesus. It speaks like Satan. It looks like Jesus. In other words, if you would look at this person or people, this beast who it represents, it looks like Jesus. It looks like a Christian. All appearances, it looks like a Christian. But the words that come out of its mouth are the words of the dragon. Now, think about those 7 churches. Did we see any influences of people that looked like Jesus, but actually spoke words of the dragon? Anybody think of any of the examples? Because almost in every church they had one. There was, Jezebel. Jezebel, right? She looked like, she was a prophetess. She looked the part, but what were the words? What did she want the church to do? She wanted the church to follow the ways of Rome, right? To participate in the trade guilds and the things like that. We had Balaam, we had the Nicolaitans, we had all these internal people inside the church that actually cooperated with Rome, right? So they're false prophets. If you look at Israel through the years, they had false prophets too, right? This is not unusual, right? There's always been false prophets. There's people that look the part, but they actually teach God's people to compromise their faith and side with a worldly way of living, right? Whatever the way of the world is. In the way of Rome, it was Pax Romana, remember? Trust in Rome, they will provide you peace. If you follow the way of Rome, then everything will work out for you. If you don't follow the way of Rome, then there's a crucifix waiting for you, right? We'll put you on a cross. And so inside the church, there is these influences that lead the people astray. There's false prophets, right? So let's kind of go through this. So it had 2 horns like a lamb that was speaking like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast and its presence. It also makes the earth and those who live in it worship the first beast. So who is the land beast encouraging the people to worship? The sea beast. The prophet is encouraging the people who are not Christians to worship the Roman Empire or Babylon or whatever, the nation like Egypt or whatever, the ones that are oppressing people, using its power for ways that are away from the way of Jesus. And so this, it exercises the power of the first beast and its presence. It also makes the earth and those who live in it worship the first beast, whose fatal wound was healed. It does great signs so that it even makes fire come down from heaven to earth in the presence of his people. So it's doing miracles. It's, you almost are looking at this, you got the dragon, you got the sea beast, and you got the land beast. It's like the unholy trinity, right? And so this is the way that it's being carried out. And the false prophets even doing miracles to try to trick the people to believing the first beast is to be worshipped. Deceives those who live on earth by the signs that it was allowed to do in the presence of the beast. It told those who live on earth to make an image for the beast, who had been wounded by the sword and yet come back to life again. And so it made an image for the beast who had been wounded by the sword and yet come back to life again. So it made an image for the Roman Empire. It made an image for Caesar Nero. Now, that word image in Greek is icon, and it's the same word used for a coin. So I think we have can we put a coin on the screen? Yeah, there's a coin. That is, if you look, you start on the bottom, it's Nero Caesar. And so this would be an icon or an image. It's the Greek word icon. And so anytime somebody looked at that coin, they would understand who's in charge. Every time there was a new Caesar, they minted new coins. I don't know what happened to the old coins. I guess they melted them down. But every time there's a new Caesar, new coins. This is a golden coin with Nero. So this is an image of the beast, an icon of the beast. And then notice what happens. It was allowed to give breath to the beast image, so the beast image would even speak and cause anyone who didn't worship the beast image to put to death. So what we have here is a kind of a callback to Genesis chapter 2, and Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Really, in Genesis chapter 1, it says, let us create God in our image. That's chapter 1, verse 26. It's the Trinity is saying, let us create human beings in our image. So we are created as an image or an icon of God. So when someone looks at us, they see God, right? We're image bearers. We're creating the image of God. And then in chapter 2 in Genesis, Adam, the human one, the dirt man, it says that God breathed into Adam the breath of life, and Adam became a human being, right? So this particular phrasing here is a callback to that. And so it says, it was allowed to give breath to the beast image so that the beast image would even speak and cause anyone who didn't worship the beast image to put to death. So there's this beast, the second beast, who creates an image or an icon of the first beast, a coin, a philosophy of life, statues, and breathes life into it. So what would you call a statue that is worshipped? An idol. And so there's this whole way of life now. Caesar is being worshipped. Nero demanded to be worshipped. Domitian demanded to be worshipped. A lot of the Caesars waited until they died before they were worshipped. But there was the evil ones, Nero and Domitian, who were kind of egotistical, who wanted to be worshipped when they were alive. And so we see how is this Holy Spirit, the unholy spirit, this third beast is kind of breathing life into these idols, and people are worshiping it. It's kind of all a parody. Don't you see it? Just kind of all a parody of the original Trinity. And so we have this line in the sand that's being drawn between God and his army and the unholy Trinity. Do you see it? Are you with me? Yeah. Let's see. Where are we at? Do you remember that conversation where Jesus was asked, should we pay taxes to Caesar? Remember that conversation? What did Jesus say? Anybody remember? Before that, I said, give me a coin, right? Give me a coin. Whose image is on that coin? And what did they say? Caesar. So what did Jesus say? Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, right? So give to Caesar what is Caesar's. That of the world, right? Give him taxes, give him anything in the world. But give unto God what is God's. What's God's image? We're created in the image of God. And so Jesus was saying that we give Caesar what Caesar's do, but we give God us, all of us, right? We are created in the image of God. So there's this play on that as well in here, is that there's this, we are the image of God, and then there's these idols that are created, these false images of God or the way of God, these idols that are worshipped, like the coin represents Caesar. Caesar is being worshipped. And there's been idols throughout history. The golden calf, right? And people breathe life into these idols and they worship them. And so we have competing ideologies. We have the way of God, that we worship God. We are his image bearers. And then the other way is the way of the dragon, in which we worship idols. Idols that are made to represent false gods, false prophets, that of the Roman Empire and the false prophets. There's another quote I have on the bottom of that page. It says, if Adam and Eve are fashioned in the image of God, who breathed life into them at the creation, so the second beast fashions a false image of what it means to be human, enticing men and women to exchange their God-given glory for a cheapened form of existence. I like that. That's a good quote. Any questions about the second beast and the image before we get to the mark of the beast? All right, let's go to the mark of the beast. verses 16 to 18. It forces everyone, the great and small, the small and great, the rich and poor, the free and slaves, to have a mark put on their right hand or on their forehead. It will not allow anyone to make a purchase or sell anything unless the person has that mark with the beast's name or the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let anyone who understands calculate the beast's number, for it's a human being's number. Its number is 666. And so let's talk about that 666 first part, and then we'll talk about the mark, because I know this is always an interesting conversation. So anybody want to take a guess what 666 represents? Let's talk numbers first. What does 6 represent? Incomplete. So if 7 is complete, 6 is 1 less than 7. So 6 is incomplete or imperfect, because 7 also means perfect or whole. So not whole, not perfect, not complete. So 6 represents that. It's important that we recognize that. So whoever this is, it's not complete, not perfect. So there's this whole thing. We've talked about numbers so much, right? There's this whole thing of numerology. So if you take, I don't know if you were a kid, did you ever do little codes and stuff? Like you send a letter to somebody and you make out some sort of code and they have to figure it out. We did that as kids. We were silly. But, A or 1 is, A is 1, B is 2, and you do stuff like that, right? But so that was really popular in the ancient days. In fact, did anybody remember studying about Pompeii and the volcano? Anybody study that in school? Well, the volcano, the ashes covered Pompeii and preserved so much of their culture, where most ancient cultures have wasted away. And it's one interesting thing that was found is graffiti on the walls of Pompeii. And one phrase that was written, and this is completely true. See if I can. I love her. This is what's written on a wall, whose number is 545. That was written on a wall in Pompeii. I love her. Her number is 545. So if you were a teenager, a young adult, or a kid, whatever, and you're walking by that wall and you see, so-and-so loves so-and-so, and their number is 545, what would you be doing? You'd be getting your coding out and you try to figure out who's 545. This is the way the world worked then. And so what John is writing, this number 666, Jesus is giving him this number, he's writing this down, the number 666, the Jewish people would be then processing. They'd be going through in their mind, well, who's 666, right? Because it says it's a person, right? It's a number of this calls for wisdom. Let the one who understands calculate the beast's number, for it's a human being's number. It's number 666. So this number 666 represents a human being. So who is it? And so let me say it this way. If you get on the internet and type in 666, it's an adventure. I mean, it is a comedy. Every person in history, somebody's figured out a way to translate somebody's name into 666, right? Throughout history, every president, like you can go back to Reagan, and I mean, you just go back all the way through Obama. You translate their name to Portuguese, and it's 666. I mean, it's just kind of silly, right? Every historical person, Hitler was 666. I mean, you can translate everybody and get to 666, right? If you try really hard, anybody could be 666. Even Martin Luther thought the Pope was 666, and the Pope said that Martin Luther's 666. I mean, seriously, they figured out ways to translate the names to 666. So one thing that's important when we say this, we don't know for sure, right? It's important. But every commentary that I referred to today, and I went through every one of them, I think there's like 25, they say more than likely it's Nero Caesar. Because Nero Caesar translated from Greek to Hebrew, and then numerology, it's 666. And so most scholars are saying that this beast that did all this horrible stuff is an example of, that Nero is an example of this idea of the beast, of the Roman Empire, worship of Caesar, doing evil stuff, persecuting Christians, all of these things. Of course, it's not just Caesar Nero. This idea of people who have done awful things and evil things and have turned people away from God have been historic, right? There's still beasts that exist in our world. There's still false prophets that exist in our world that are tempting people to compromise their faith. This was a historic event. This was written about a historic person. But just like Babylon continues historically, just like the four horsemen continue to ride, these ideas continue to circulate. There's always beasts that are tempting the church to compromise their faith. So let's talk about the mark. The mark. The mark is a parody of the seal that was put on the Christians back in between the sixth and seventh trumpet. You remember? Our sixth and seventh seal. Who can stand? The big earthquake took place. Who can stand? That question loomed, and then we turned, and there was 144,000 people sealed, right? And that represented 12 times 12 times 10 times 10, the people of God. And in that world, 144,000 would be like, 3 billion people. I mean, it's a huge number, right? Back then, 144,000 was like infinity in the brains of people, right? And so there's this big army that were sealed with God. So the mark of the beast, is a parody of the seal that was put on the Christians. Does that make sense? It's also a parody of the Shema from Deuteronomy 6. I think we have that on the scripture, Deuteronomy 6. Notice this. This is, again, I refer to this one all the time in preaching. Israel, listen, our God is the Lord, only the Lord. Love the Lord with God with all your heart, all your being, and all your strength. These words that I am commanding you today must always be on your minds. Recite them to your children. Talk about them when you are sitting around your house and when you are out and about, when you are lying down and when you're getting up. Tie them on your hand as a sign. They should be on your forehead as a symbol. Hand and forehead. So the mark is put on the hand or the forehead. And so this is a callback to Deuteronomy. That didn't come out of the blue. The mark of the beast wasn't something that was just invented. It wasn't literally put on the forehead or on the hand. It was a symbol that represented everything that is not of God, right? And it's interesting when you take a look at the mark, it has economic sanctions on it, right? It will not allow anyone to make a purchase or sell anything unless the person has a mark with the beast's name or the number of its name. So without Caesar's name or the number 666. And so this idea is, in that day, just like we talked about with the seven churches, there was this temptation to worship Caesar in order to receive a certificate to buy and sell in the marketplace. And so it was there as a temptation of compromise for the Christians to participate in the economy of the day. They had to worship Caesar. And so in order to get that certificate to participate in the economy in the Roman Empire, they received the mark, right? They received some sort of symbol that allowed them to purchase in the marketplace. Kind of how we talked about the Book of Life, the name written in the Book of Life. It was an act of worship to Caesar. So, it's not a vaccine. It's not a microchip. It's none of that, right? It is something that took place back then. And I believe the idea of worshiping an idol and participating in the idol's way of life still exists, right? So this is not to say that this idea of worshiping a false god is in the past. It still happens. Do you agree? We're all tempted to do that. So even though, we're not talking about a literal mark on the hand and forehead, this idea of selling our soul to something still exists. That's what's important here. We have the dragon and we have the two beasts attacking God's people. And how are they attacking God's people? Well, Satan is using two beasts, two monsters, Leviathan and Behemoth, this land and sea beasts, the empire, Babylon, Roman Empire, and the false prophets that are within the church to lead God's people away, turn out the light, to tell them, to keep them from witnessing to God. Does that make sense? That's how Satan works today, right? Satan still uses organizations and institutions and false prophets to steer us away. I mean, all you have to do is listen to the propaganda that is being spoken. Every organization, every country in existence, they all have propaganda. They all have a way of life they're trying to sell us on, right? Everyone. I mean, it's been throughout history. Nothing changes. It all continues. Everybody demands worship. Every idol demands worship. And so Satan is using all of these things, even though the dragon is defeated. That's how Satan works. All right. But to end this on a positive note, let's turn to chapter 14 and just read a few verses here to be reminded of that this unholy Trinity is not the only people at stake or involved here in this war. So let's go chapter 14, verse 1. This is not in your packet. We'll review this next time. Then they looked, and there was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion. With him were 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. I heard a sound from heaven that was like the sound of rushing water and loud thunder. The sound I heard was like that of harpists playing their harps. They sing a new song in front of the throne, the four living creatures and the elders, and no one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been purchased from the earth. They weren't defiled with women, for these people who follow the Lamb wherever he goes are virgins. They were purchased from among humankind as early produce for God and the Lamb. No lie came from their mouths. They are blameless. Verse 6. Then I saw another angel flying overhead with eternal good news, or you could say eternal gospel, to proclaim to those who live on earth and to every nation, tribe, language, and people. So in chapter 13, we just talked about the unholy Trinity. In chapter 14, we see the Lord's army. 144,000, which seems like a small number to us. But remember, we're not talking about a literal 144,000. We're talking about God's people, all of God's people. And that's an army. And so remember, that's kind of what we have building towards here. We have the unholy Trinity versus the Father, Son, and Spirit and the people of God. And so there's this war. We all know who wins, right? Right? We all know who wins, right? We read that the last section, right? We know who wins. So it's kind of like we got a spoiler. Somebody spoiled the whole movie for us. We know how it ends. But that's kind of the point. We see these two forces that appear like they're equals, but they're not. In fact, when you take a look at it, there's not even a war, right? We get to this thing where there's this Armageddon where we think there's going to be this big war, but guess what? There isn't a war. Because why? Because Jesus already won the victory, right? It's already over. Jesus accomplished that. So Satan and his army is already defeated. Their power is so limited. And once we recognize that death has already been defeated, that the enemy can't try to persuade us with death, because if they kill us, we're resurrected, right? That's not an attraction to the people of God, right? The only thing that Satan and his minions can do is to turn us away from God while we're on this earth. And when we compare that to eternity, it seems like we have this really small window, this really short window on earth to fight this fight, and we have eternity waiting for us. Does that make sense? And so the whole book of Revelation is written to these 7 churches that are facing the dragon and the 2 beasts. Remember, this isn't a linear story. This is setting up, explaining why these churches were facing the compromise. It was the dragon and the 2 beasts were tempting these 7 churches. Now we understand why the seven churches were going through such awful time. It's because there was this cosmic war going on behind the scenes. But the whole point of the entire book of Revelation is to reveal Jesus. Jesus is on the throne, the slaughtered lamb who's victorious. Amen? And so we're called to follow the way of the Lamb. Follow the way of Lamb, even if that takes us to death. Death, resurrection, ascension, the way of the Lamb. And that's what those seven churches had to deal with. I'm grateful that we live in a nation where we aren't persecuted, right? Aren't you thankful for that? That we don't have, but the compromise, or the temptation to compromise, it's strong, right? It's strong. I'm grateful during Lent that I'm not on social media. So I don't have to read all the back and forth stuff that's going on right now in the world, right? It's ugly, because I have people tell me, you should see what so-and-so said on Twitter. No, I really don't want to know, right? But that's where the temptation hits us. The temptation is to believe these propagandas, to believe the way of these worldviews, to worship these idols that aren't Christ, right? And there's a bazillion of them, right? I mean, I'm not talking about one, I'm talking about countless of them. But they're still in existence trying to get your heart right now. You just got to hang in there and stand up for the Lamb, right? Because the victory is already being won. Right? Isn't that good news? All right. What time is it? Any questions before we close in prayer? Next week is Holy Week, so we are not meeting next week, right? And the reason we're not meeting is because Thursday we have a come-and-go communion, either in the morning between 11 and 1 and 6 and 8, right? So you pick if you want to come receive communion during those times. During the evening between 6 and 8, there is a light supper in the fellowship hall, so you can come and take communion in the evening and then eat, or you can stop by and eat and then come and take communion if you'd like. So that's Thursday, that's Monday, Thursday. And then Friday, Good Friday at 7 o'clock, we're having our Tenebrae service, our second annual Tenebrae service. So that's on the agenda next week, and we have church council next week too, so that's Tuesday. So I needed a little bit of break on Wednesday, if that's okay. Thank you for the break, that's good. And then, so next time we get together will be 2 weeks from tonight, and let's see what our homework is. It's to read chapters 14 to 16, 14, 15, and 16. We've been kind of spoiled. We've just done a chapter the last 2 times. We're going to do 3 next time. And so there's some questions there. What similarities do you see to what's already happened in Revelation as you read those 3 chapters? In light of what's happening so far in this vision, chapters 12 to 22, this next section, how does this fit in? And then, of course, what's confusing and what's clear? And then bonus, what do the 2 harvests in chapter 14 represent? Do a little digging there, a little homework from Pastor Paul to you. Especially over Easter. You got nothing else to do, right? All right, any questions before we pray? All right, let's pray the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.